In the small coastal town of Millbrook, Oregon, a struggling Marine veteran was about to face her worst nightmare. What started as a desperate job interview took a shocking turn when she came face to face with public humiliation that would ignite a brotherhood spanning generations. Elena Vasquez wasn't your typical diner owner. For 3 tours of duty, she had spent her life serving in Afghanistan's most dangerous regions, known for her unwavering courage under fire and fierce loyalty to her fellow Marines. When she encountered restaurant owner Vincent Romano's cruel dismissal, calling her damaged goods unfit for civilian work, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would transform not just her life, but an entire community. Elena's quiet retreat from Romano's upscale restaurant that day would lead to a viral movement of military solidarity that would reshape how America treats its veterans. What began as one woman's private shame would become a national conversation about honor, service, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. The town of Millbrook would never be the same after 50 Marines in dress blues filled every table of Elena's struggling diner, proving that some bonds never break and some fights are worth having, no matter the odds. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ancient coffee machine wheezed to life at 4:30 a.m., its death rattle echoing through Elena's diner. Elena Vasquez stood behind the counter, calloused hands moving through the familiar ritual, coffee brewing, grill heating, the peeling linoleum. Beneath her feet told decades of service, back when her father Miguel had run this place with pride. Now the diner felt like a mausoleum. Elena's reflection caught in the chrome coffee machine, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in, regulation-tight bun despite being discharged 2 years ago. Her father's old Marine Corps dress jacket hung by the register, fabric still holding traces of his cologne. She'd kept it pristine, the ribbons and decorations a testament to service that once meant something. Morning light filtered through, windows that needed washing, illuminating empty tables and cracked vinyl booths. Tommy Morrison would arrive soon, punctual as artillery fire, wheeling himself through the door for his usual black coffee. Eleanor's hands trembled as she counted the till. $43.16. Not enough for the electric bill, let alone rent. The weight of failure pressed against her chest like body armor in Afghanistan heat. The bell above the door chimed. A man in a crisp suit stepped inside, polished shoes clicking against worn floor. Everything about him screamed authority, from his perfectly knotted tie to the manila envelope in his hand. Elena Vasquez? His voice carried the practiced neutrality of bad news. That's me. Elena straightened, muscle memory pulling her shoulders back into military bearing. He placed the envelope on the counter like a grenade with the pin pulled. Eviction notice. You have 30 days. The words hit harder than the IED that had taken her hearing for 3 days in Kandahar. Elena stared at the envelope, her father's voice echoing. This place is our legacy, mija. After he left, Elena sat alone in the silence. The bell chimed again, and Tommy rolled through the door right on schedule. Rough night, Sergeant. Elena poured his coffee without being asked. Every night's rough, Tank. Tommy Morrison had done 3 tours in Vietnam, came home to a country that spat on his uniform. He understood the weight of invisible wounds better than most. You know, Tommy said, accepting his mug despite the tremor in his left arm. Romano's is hiring. Elena's jaw tightened. Romano's, the upscale restaurant on Harbor Street where tourists paid $20 for fish. Vincent Romano had inherited the place, turned it into a monument to his own success. I'm not looking for work. Elena, this place is bleeding money. You can't save it by working yourself to death. 2 hours later, Elena stood outside Romano's, her father's Marine Corps dress jacket hanging stiff and formal over her jeans. The restaurant's interior screamed expensive taste, all dark wood and brass fixtures. Vincent Romano emerged from the kitchen, tall and confident in his pressed white shirt and designer glasses. "You must be here about the server position," he said. "Yes, sir. Elena Vasquez." She extended her hand, but Vincent's attention had shifted to her jacket. "Military?" The word carried a subtle edge of distaste. "Marine Corps, 3 tours in Afghanistan." Something flickered in Vincent's expression, not respect, but something colder. He glanced around the dining room, noting the attention Elena's uniform was drawing. "Ms. Vasquez," Vincent's voice rose slightly, ensuring nearby tables could hear. "I appreciate your service, but Romano's caters to a sophisticated clientele. We need servers who understand fine dining, not military mess halls." Elena felt heat creep up her neck. "I've been running my own restaurant for 3 years. Vincent's laugh was sharp, dismissive. "That little diner. Fine dining requires emotional regulation. Our customers expect professional service, not someone who might have an episode during dinner rush." The words hit like sniper fire. Elena's hands clenched at her sides. "You think I'm damaged goods," Elena said quietly. Vincent shrugged. "I think you're someone who's been through trauma. But it's not what Romano's needs. We require servers who can handle pressure without complications." The restaurant had gone quiet. In the bar area, she noticed several men in short haircuts watching the exchange with growing tension. "I served my country," Elena said steadily. "And I'm sure you did your best," Vincent replied with false sympathy. "But this is civilian life, where different skills matter." Elena turned without another word, her father's jacket feeling heavier with each step. In the bar area, Master Sergeant James Washington set down his beer with deliberate precision. Around him, 3 other Marines watched Elena's retreat. "Did you hear that?" Corporal Danny Chen's voice was tight with fury. Washington's expression remained calm, but his hands had formed fists. "I heard it." Through the window, they watched Elena climb into her truck, her head bowed. Washington pulled out his phone. 30 years in the Corps had taught him many things, but the most important was this: you never leave a Marine behind. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I think it's time to make some calls." Washington's first call went to Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, 26 years in the Corps before retiring. "Iron, what's the word?" "Need you to listen, Mike. Got a situation down here in Millbrook." Washington's voice carried the measured tone of a senior NCO. "One of ours just got publicly humiliated by some civilian who thinks our service don't mean shit." He told Torres about Elena, the struggling diner, the eviction notice, the dress jacket that marked her as family. Most importantly, he told him about Vincent Romano's words, the casual cruelty that dismissed a Marine's worth. "Elena Vasquez," Torres repeated. 3 tours Afghanistan?" "Yeah. And Mike, she served with Marcus. Same unit, same deployment where we lost him." The silence stretched long enough for Washington to hear his own heartbeat. Marcus Washington had been 22 when the IED took him. "What do you need?" Torres's voice had gone cold as winter steel. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to fill Elena's diner and remind this town what honor looks like." While Washington worked his contacts, Corporal Danny Chen had already fired up his laptop in his cramped apartment. The 24-year-old had done 2 tours as a communications specialist before an IED scrambled his hearing enough to earn a medical discharge. Civilian life had been rough, too quiet, too isolated. But Danny understood social media like Washington understood tactics. His first post went up on the Marine Corps United Facebook group, 18,000 members strong. The video was simple. Danny speaking directly to the camera. Today in Millbrook, Oregon, a restaurant owner named Vincent Romano publicly humiliated a Marine veteran who was just trying to find work, called her damaged goods. Danny's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, tagging veteran groups, Marine Corps pages, military spouse networks. Tomorrow morning, dial 800 hours. Anyone who can make it to Millbrook, Oregon. Dress blues if you got 'em. We're going to show Sergeant Vasquez that the Corps doesn't abandon its own. The post had 50 shares within the first hour. Miles away, Elena sat alone in her diner as darkness settled over Millbrook. She'd closed early again, couldn't bear the thought of serving customers. The eviction notice lay spread on the counter beside her father's jacket. The humiliation at Romano's played on repeat in her mind. Vincent's voice echoing. Sometimes people just aren't cut out for civilian success. A soft knock at the diner's front door interrupted her spiral. Tommy Morrison sat outside in his wheelchair. Elena let him in. "Heard about Romano's," Tommy said without preamble. Elena poured herself coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Guess everybody knows now. The crazy vet who can't handle a simple job interview. That what you think happened?" "Isn't it?" Elena's voice cracked. "He took one look at me and saw exactly what I am. Broken." Tommy wheeled closer. "Want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a Marine who came home to a country that didn't know how to welcome her back, who lost her father while overseas fighting for people who don't appreciate the sacrifice." Tommy's voice grew firm. "I see someone who served with honor. I'm losing, Tank. The diner, my father's legacy, it's all falling apart." "Maybe, but you're still fighting. That counts for something." Elena wanted to believe him, but the weight of failure pressed too heavy. "I don't know how to do this. Civilian thing. In Afghanistan, I knew my job. Here." She gestured at the empty diner. "I'm just failing." Tommy reached across and touched her hand. "Elena, you ever hear about Chesty Puller at Chosin Reservoir?" "Of course. Surrounded by Chinese troops, outnumbered 10-1. You know what? He told his Marines." Elena managed a weak smile. "We're not retreating. We're advancing in a different direction." "Damn right. Sometimes the fight changes, but Marines adapt." After Tommy left, Elena sat in the silence of her father's diner. Outside, Millbrook slept peacefully, unaware that 200 miles away, phones were ringing and keyboards were clicking as a brotherhood spread the word. Danny Chen's post had been shared over 300 times. Comments poured in from Marines. Across the country, active duty stationed at Pendleton, reserves in Seattle, retirees from as far as Montana. Each comment carried the same message: Semper Fi, see you tomorrow. Washington's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Every call brought another confirmation. Marines changing their schedules, calling in favors, making the drive to a small Oregon coastal town they'd never heard of. By midnight, the network had spread across 3 generations of Marines. Vietnam veterans like Tommy, Iraq and Afghanistan vets like Elena, young Marines still on active duty who understood that service meant protecting your own. Vincent Romano slept soundly in his expensive house overlooking the harbor, his restaurant's reputation intact. He had no idea that his casual cruelty had awakened something powerful, the brotherhood that binds Marines across time and circumstance. In her small apartment above the diner, Elena finally fell into fitful sleep, still wearing her father's dress jacket. She dreamed of Afghanistan, of Marines who had her back. Tomorrow, she would learn that some bonds never break. Elena's alarm. Clock screamed at 5 a.m., but she was already awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling of her small apartment above the diner. Sleep had come in fragments between nightmares that mixed Afghanistan dust with Vincent Romano's sneering face. Her father's dress jacket hung on the chair beside her bed, somehow looking more dignified in the pre-dawn darkness than she felt. She dressed mechanically, Jeans, worn sneakers, the same flannel shirt she'd worn yesterday. The ritual of opening the diner felt heavier this morning, each step down the narrow stairs a countdown to another day of failure. The eviction notice still sat on the counter where she'd left it, 30 days ticking away like a time bomb. Elena unlocked the front door and stepped outside to flip the open sign, expecting to see the usual empty street. Harbour Street was deserted at this hour, just the way she preferred it, no witnesses to her slow-motion collapse. But something was different. Across the street, a figure in dark clothing stood beneath the streetlight. As Elena's eyes adjusted, she could make out the sharp creases, the military bearing, the unmistakable silhouette of dress blues. A Marine standing at parade rest, watching her diner. Elena blinked, certain she was still dreaming. But when she looked again, he was still there. And he wasn't alone. 2 more Marines emerged from the shadows near the harbour, their dress blue uniforms pristine in the morning gloom. Then 3 more from the direction of the parking lot behind Romano's. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized they weren't random early risers. They were waiting for her diner to open. The first Marine, a tall man with silver hair, and the bearing of a senior NCO, approached the door. His ribbons caught the streetlight, 3 rows of them, including a Purple Heart and Bronze Star. Elena recognized the look in his eyes immediately, the steady gaze of someone who'd seen combat and understood what it cost. "Morning, Sergeant Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command. "Master Sergeant James Washington, retired. Mind if we come in?" Elena stood frozen, her hand still on the door handle. Behind Washington, more Marines materialized from the morning shadows. Young faces and weathered ones, active duty and retired, but all wearing the same expression of determined solidarity. She counted 10, then 15, then stopped counting altogether as they continued to appear. What's happening?" Elena's voice came out smaller than she intended. Washington's expression softened slightly. "What's happening, Sergeant, is that Marines take care of Marines. Always have, always will." Elena stepped aside numbly as Washington entered, followed by a steady stream of dress blue uniforms. They moved with military precision, each Marine selecting a table or booth with practiced efficiency. The diner, which hadn't been full in months, suddenly hummed with quiet conversations and the rustle of starched fabric. A young Marine with corporal stripes approached the counter. Elena recognized him, Danny Chen, one of the Marines who'd been at Romano's yesterday. His face was serious, but his eyes held a warmth that reminded Elena of her younger Marines. "In Afghanistan." "Sergeant, we're gonna need a lot of coffee," Danny said simply, "and whatever you've got for chow. We've got about 40 Marines here, with more on the way." Elena stared at him, her hands trembling slightly. I can't afford to comp 40 breakfasts. The eviction notice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ma'am," Washington interrupted gently, "nobody said anything about comping. We're paying customers. Marines who heard about a fellow Marine running a good diner and decided to check it out." The ancient coffee machine wheezed to life as Elena moved behind the counter on autopilot. Her hands shook as she started brewing pot after pot of coffee, muscle memory taking over while her mind struggled to process what was happening. Through the window, she could see more Marines arriving, some in personal vehicles, others stepping. Off a charter bus that had just pulled up outside, a Marine with gunnery sergeant stripes helped her carry coffee pots to the tables. "Heard you served with Marcus Washington," he said quietly. "Good Marine. His dad's been looking out for his Marines ever since we lost him." Elena's throat tightened. She remembered Marcus, young, eager, always talking about his father who'd been a Marine before him. The kid had been standing next to her when the IED went off. She'd carried him to the medevac helicopter, but they'd all known it was too late. Yeah, she managed. Good Marine. The diner filled beyond capacity. Marines stood along the walls when the booths and tables were full, their conversations a low murmur of shared experiences and dark humor. Elena moved through them in a daze, pouring coffee, taking orders for eggs and bacon and pancakes, her father's industrial grill working harder than it had in years. Through the front window, Elena could see townspeople gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the unusual sight of 50 Marines in dress blues filling the small diner. Some pulled out phones to take pictures, others simply stared in wonder at the sea of military precision and brotherhood that had descended on their quiet street. Vincent Romano's Mercedes crept by slowly, the restaurant owner's face visible through the passenger window. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something that might have been fear as he realized what he was seeing. Elena caught his eye for a moment through the glass, and for the first time since yesterday's humiliation, she felt something other than shame. She felt protected. Washington appeared at her elbow as she refilled his coffee. "Sergeant, there's something. You should know. That business yesterday at Romano's, it wasn't about you not being good enough. It was about him being too small to recognize what real service looks like." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. Around her, the diner buzzed with life and purpose, filled with the voices of men and women who understood what it meant to serve something larger than themselves. For the first time in months, Elena's diner felt like home. By 8:30 a.m., the crowd outside Elena's diner had grown beyond curious townspeople. News vans from Portland and Salem lined Harbor Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the morning sky like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters clutched coffee cups and notebooks, interviewing anyone willing to talk about the unprecedented gathering inside the small coastal diner. Elena watched through the front window as a CNN correspondent adjusted her earpiece, practicing her lead-in. "This is Harbor Street in Millbrook, Oregon, where 50 Marines in dress blues have gathered to support a fellow veteran." The surreal nature of the morning hadn't diminished. If anything, it had intensified as more Marines continued to arrive, some traveling from as far as California and Washington State. Elena's ancient grill worked overtime, the bacon grease spattering like friendly fire while she flipped pancakes. With mechanical precision, Danny Chen sat at the counter, his laptop open, refreshing social media feeds with the focused intensity he'd once brought to radio communications in Helmand Province. His original post had exploded beyond anything he'd imagined. Over 50,000 shares and climbing, with comments pouring in from veterans, military families, and civilians across the country. "Sergeant Vasquez," Danny called out, turning, his laptop screen toward Elena. "You need to see this." The screen showed a Twitter thread with hundreds of retweets. Photos of Elena's diner packed with Marines, videos of the gathering shot through the windows, and story after story from other veterans sharing their own experiences with civilian rejection and brotherhood support. "Marines for Elena is trending," Danny explained, his voice carrying the excitement of a successful mission. "We're not just talking local news anymore. This is going national." Elena felt her chest tighten. The attention was overwhelming, the opposite of the invisibility she'd cultivated since returning from Afghanistan. She preferred the shadows, the quiet routine of early mornings and late nights, where no one expected her to be anything more than functional. Washington noticed her expression and approached the counter. "Sergeant, I know this feels like a lot, but sometimes the Corps needs to remind the civilian world what we're about. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for every veteran who's been written off as damaged goods." Before Elena could respond, the front door chimed and Maria Santos pushed through the crowd of Marines, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a night shift. Her dark eyes swept the packed diner, taking in the sea of dress blues and the barely controlled chaos of Elena trying to serve everyone. "Elena Vasquez," What the hell is going on here? Maria's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known Elena since they were kids, long before military service and trauma and failure had shaped them into different people. Elena looked up from the grill, a spatula in one hand and sweat beading on her forehead. Maria, No, don't you Maria me. Maria Santos had never been easily intimidated, not by the bullies in high school, and certainly not by a diner full of Marines. She marched straight to the counter, grabbed an apron from the hook, and tied it around her waist. You're about to collapse from exhaustion, and these good people need feeding. Move over. Without waiting for permission, Maria started taking orders, her pen flying across her notepad as she navigated between tables with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing crisis situations. The Marines responded to her no-nonsense attitude with grins and yes, ma'am responses that would have made their drill instructors proud. Thank you, Elena whispered as Maria passed behind the counter. Thank me later. Right now, we've got work to do. Outside, the media circus continued to grow. Elena caught glimpses of reporters interviewing Marines who'd finished eating, their responses measured and professional. Master Sergeant Torres, who'd driven down from Portland, spoke into a microphone about the importance of supporting veterans in transition. Elena Vasquez represents thousands of men and women who've served this country with honor, Torres said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. When someone attacks one of our own, especially someone who's already fighting just to keep her family's legacy alive, that's when the Corps steps up. That's what we do. Vincent Romano's restaurant sat nearly empty across the street, its usual morning customers apparently drawn to the spectacle at Elena's. Through the window, Elena could see Vincent standing behind his bar, his face pale as he watched his business hemorrhage customers to the diner he'd dismissed as failing just yesterday. A young Marine approached the counter with his empty coffee cup. Ma'am, there's a reporter outside who wants to interview you. Something about this being a David and Goliath story. Elena's hand stilled on the coffee pot. The thought of cameras, of her face broadcast to strangers who would judge her, made her chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Washington appeared beside the young Marine. Your call, Sergeant, but if you're willing to speak, it might help other veterans know they're not alone. Elena looked around the diner, at Maria efficiently taking orders, at Danny coordinating social media responses, at dozens of Marines who'd driven hours just to have breakfast in her father's restaurant. For the first time since Afghanistan, she wasn't fighting alone. Tell the reporter, Elena said, untying her apron with hands that barely trembled, that Sergeant Elena Vasquez has something to say. Through the window she could see Vincent Romano watching from across the street, his empire of casual cruelty beginning to crumble under the weight of consequences he'd never imagined possible. The Brotherhood had Elena's back. Now it was time for the world to hear her story. The Millbrook High School gymnasium had never held a crowd like this. Every folding chair was occupied, with standing room only along the walls where Marines in dress blues stood at parade rest beside civilians, clutching coffee cups and nervous energy. The emergency town meeting had been called for 7 p.m., but by 6:30, Mayor Patricia Pat Hendricks was already looking at the largest gathering in the town's history. Elena sat in the front row, her father's dress jacket replaced by a simple black blouse that Maria had brought her. Washington sat to her right, his presence steady as granite, while Tommy Morrison held the aisle position in his wheelchair, his Vietnam veteran cap casting shadows across his weathered features. Across the aisle, Vincent Romano sat with his daughter Sarah, a 20-year-old college student whose social work textbooks lay forgotten in her lap. Her face bore the flush of embarrassment and anger that had been building since she'd watched the news coverage of her father's cruelty playing on every major network. Mayor Hendricks took the microphone, her Navy officer bearing evident despite 20 years in civilian politics. We're here tonight because our community needs to have an honest conversation about how we treat our veterans. Recent events have brought national attention to Millbrook, and while I'm proud of the support we've seen for Sergeant Vasquez, we also need to address the actions that made this gathering necessary. Elena's hands clenched in her lap as all eyes turned toward her. The gymnasium felt like a courtroom, with cameras rolling and reporters scribbling notes. This was the opposite of every instinct she'd developed since coming home. The need to stay invisible to avoid drawing attention to her struggles. "Sergeant Vasquez," Mayor Hendricks continued, "would you like to share your experience with the community?" Elena stood slowly, muscle memory pulling her shoulders back into military bearing. The microphone felt foreign in her hands, but when she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of someone who'd given briefings under incoming fire. 3 years ago, I came home from Afghanistan to bury my father and inherit his diner. I thought the hardest part of my service was behind me." Elena's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm. "I was wrong. The hardest part was learning that some people see my uniform as a sign of damage rather than service, that they assume PTSD makes me unreliable instead of someone who's learned to function under pressure most people can't imagine." She turned slightly, her gaze finding Vincent Romano in the crowd. "Yesterday, a business owner in this town told me I was damaged goods, that I wasn't fit for civilian work because I might have an episode during dinner rush. He said this loudly, in front of customers, making sure everyone heard him tear down someone who'd served 3 tours, defending his right to run his mouth." The gymnasium erupted in murmurs and scattered applause. Vincent's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the arms of his folding chair. Elena continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But what happened next showed me something I'd forgotten. The Corps doesn't abandon its own. 50 Marines drove from across the Pacific Northwest to remind me that service matters, that sacrifice has meaning, and that brotherhood doesn't end at discharge." Sarah Romano stood abruptly, her voice cutting through the crowd noise. "My father owes you an apology, Sergeant Vasquez. What he said was cruel and ignorant, and it doesn't represent our family's values." Vincent jerked upright as if slapped. "Sarah, sit down." "No, Dad, I won't sit down while you embarrass our family and this community." Sarah's voice carried the moral certainty of youth, but also the pain of a daughter watching her father revealed as something smaller than she'd believed. "I'm studying to become a social worker, specifically to help veterans transition to civilian life. Do you have any idea how it feels to watch my own father attack someone I'm training to support?" Vincent stood slowly, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. "Sarah, you don't understand the pressures of running a business. I understand treating people with basic human dignity," Sarah shot back, "something you apparently forgot." The crowd fell silent as Vincent Romano faced his daughter's disappointment and a gymnasium full of witnesses to his character. For a moment, Elena thought he might double down, might justify his cruelty with more cruelty. Instead, Vincent's shoulders sagged. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible through the microphone. "Sergeant Vasquez, you're right. What I said was inexcusable." His voice grew stronger, though it shook with emotion. "I was cruel because I was threatened by what you represent. Real service, real sacrifice, things I've never done." Vincent turned to face the crowd, his expensive suit looking suddenly shabby under the gymnasium lights. "I've spent my whole life inheriting success, never earning it. When I saw your ribbons, your service record, your willingness to keep fighting, even when everything was falling apart, it made me feel small. So I tried to make you smaller." The gymnasium had gone completely silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights, and the distant sound of traffic on Harbour Street. "I can't undo what I said," Vincent continued, his voice breaking slightly, "but I can try to make it right. Tomorrow morning, I'm making a donation to the Millbrook Veterans Fund, equal to Romano's monthly gross receipts. And I'm offering you a partnership, not employment partnership, to create a catering program that employs veterans and serves veteran events." Elena stared at him, searching his face for signs of performance, for the calculated moves of a businessman trying to salvage his reputation. Instead, she saw something she recognized from her own mirror, the exhausted relief of someone finally telling the truth about their failures. "It's a start," Elena said finally. "But talk is cheap, Mr. Romano. Let's see what your actions look like." The gymnasium erupted in applause, but Elena barely heard it. For the first time since coming home from Afghanistan, she felt like she was advancing rather than retreating. 3 weeks after the town meeting, Elena's diner hummed with activity that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. The morning rush brought a steady stream of customers, Marines stopping by for coffee before heading to their duty stations, local fishermen grabbing breakfast before dawn departures, and an increasing number of tourists drawn by the national news coverage of the Marine Brotherhood diner. Elena stood behind the counter, watching Maria Santos coordinate a group of volunteers who'd arrived to help with the renovation project that had grown far beyond what she'd ever imagined possible. The peeling linoleum was being replaced with new tiles donated by Harbour Street Hardware, fresh paint-covered walls that had yellowed with decades of grease and neglect. Even the ancient coffee machine had been replaced with a commercial-grade model that actually worked without mechanical coaxing. "Elena, where do you want these supplies?" Sarah Romano stood in the doorway, her arms full of cleaning materials and paintbrushes. Over the past 3 weeks, Vincent's daughter had become a regular presence at the diner, working alongside Elena, despite her father's complicated position in the community. "Storage room in the back," Elena replied, noting how Sarah had thrown herself into the renovation work with the same intensity she brought to her social work studies. The young woman seemed determined to make amends for her father's actions through sheer force of will and physical labor. Tommy Morrison wheeled himself through the maze of renovation supplies, a clipboard balanced on his lap. His role as unofficial project coordinator had given him new purpose, and Elena noticed he'd started arriving earlier each morning, eager to review progress and plan the day's work. "Got the final estimate for the kitchen equipment upgrade," Tommy announced, holding up the clipboard. "Vincent's donation covered it, plus the Veterans Business Grant came through. We're looking at a complete overhaul, new grill, expanded storage, the works." Elena nodded, still struggling to process how quickly her circumstances had changed. The Veterans Business Grant application had been Washington's idea, something he'd helped her navigate through layers of bureaucracy she'd never known existed. The funding would allow her to expand operations, potentially hire additional staff, and transform her father's struggling diner into something sustainable. The front door chimed, and Vincent Romano entered, carrying a stack of folders and wearing an expression of cautious determination. His relationship with Elena remained carefully professional, built on mutual respect rather than warmth, but his actions had proven more reliable than his words at the town meeting. "Partnership paperwork," Vincent said, placing the folders on the counter. "The catering contract for the Veterans Day event is finalized, and I've got 3 more organizations interested in our services." Elena flipped through the contracts, noting the details of their unusual business arrangement. Romano's would handle the upscale catering events, while Elena's diner provided the home-style cooking and veteran-focused atmosphere that had made them locally famous. It was an imperfect partnership between former enemies, but it was working. "Sarah's been telling me about the support group meetings," Vincent continued, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone still learning to navigate relationships, based on respect rather than authority. I'd like to make a regular donation to cover meeting expenses, coffee, materials, whatever you need. The Veterans Support Group had been Washington's initiative, but it had found its natural home in Elena's diner. Every Tuesday evening, the back dining room filled with veterans from across the coast, sharing stories and strategies for civilian transition. Elena had been reluctant to participate at first, but gradually found herself drawn into conversations that felt more like family than therapy. That would be helpful, Elena replied neutrally. She wasn't ready to forgive Vincent completely, but she could acknowledge his efforts to make concrete amends. Washington emerged from the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and his hands dusty from helping install new shelving. His presence at the diner had become as regular as Elena's own, and she'd begun to understand that mentoring her gave him purpose in processing his own grief over Marcus. "Sergeant, we need to talk about staffing," Washington said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Word's getting out about what we're building here. I've got 3 unemployed veterans asking about work, and if the catering business keeps growing, you're going to need help." Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The instinctive resistance to depending on others that had kept her isolated for so long. But looking around the diner, at volunteers working to improve her father's legacy, at partnerships that had emerged from conflict, at a community that had rallied to support her fight, she realized that accepting help wasn't the same as admitting defeat. "Set up interviews for next week," Elena said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But they need to understand, this isn't just a job. This is about building something that lasts." Maria appeared at her elbow, paint streaks on her scrubs from helping with the wall renovation. "Elena Vasquez, did you just agree to hire employees?" "I guess I did." "Good, because Tommy's already put together job descriptions. Sarah's researched the hiring process, and Washington's got 3 character references ready for each candidate." Maria's grin was infectious. "We've all been waiting for you to catch up with what the rest of us already knew." "What's that?" "That you're not fighting alone anymore. And maybe that's exactly how it's supposed to be." Eleanor looked around. Her father's diner, transformed by community effort, sustained by unexpected partnerships, and filled with the kind of purpose that had been missing since she'd returned from Afghanistan. For the first time in years, the future felt possible rather than threatening, but in the back of her mind, she wondered how long it could last. Growth brought new challenges, and Elena had learned not to trust stability that felt too good to be true. The corporate representative arrived on a Tuesday morning, wearing a $1,000 suit and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. Richard Sterling from Pacific Coast Restaurant Group swept into the diner with the confidence of someone accustomed to buying whatever caught his interest. "Miss Vasquez, I'm here to make you an offer that could change your life," Sterling announced, setting his briefcase on the counter as if he owned the place. Several of the morning regulars looked up from their coffee, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Elena continued wiping down the coffee machine, not bothering to hide her irritation. "Not interested in whatever you're selling?" "I'm not selling anything, I'm buying." Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Pacific Coast wants to purchase Elena's diner for $2.5 million. Cash offer, closing within 30 days. The number hit Elena like a physical blow. $2.5 million, enough to pay off every debt, buy a house anywhere she wanted, never worry about money again, enough to escape the constant pressure of keeping her father's legacy alive while building something sustainable for the future. Tommy Morrison rolled closer, his weathered face creased with concern. "Elena, you don't have to listen to this." "Actually, she does," Sterling continued, smoothly, "because Pacific Coast isn't just interested in the diner. We're prepared to offer Mr. Romano $3 million for his restaurant as well. We're buying out the entire Harbor Street restaurant corridor to develop a luxury dining complex. Elena's hands stilled on the coffee machine. Vincent Romano appeared in the doorway, having heard his name mentioned. His face had gone pale, and Elena could see the wheels turning in his mind, calculating profit margins, considering possibilities, weighing the appeal of starting fresh somewhere else. "Vincent," Elena said quietly, "tell me you're not seriously considering this." Vincent avoided her eyes. "Elena, it's a lot of money, more than either of our businesses will ever be worth individually. Our partnership would be honored through the transition," Sterling interrupted. "Pacific Coast values community relationships. We'd be happy to offer both of you management positions in the new complex." Elena felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of walls closing in that she remembered from the worst days in Afghanistan. All the progress of the past month, the renovations, the support groups, the partnerships built from conflict, reduced to a corporate acquisition and management positions in someone else's vision. Sarah Romano burst through the front door, her face flushed from running. "Dad, don't sign anything. I just spent 2 hours researching Pacific Coast Restaurant Group online." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through saved articles. "They specialize in acquiring successful veteran-owned businesses, promising to maintain the authentic atmosphere, then completely changing everything within 6 months. Sterling's polished smile flickered. "Ms. Romano, I think you'll find our track record speaks for itself." "Your track record includes buying 3 veteran-owned restaurants in California last year," Sarah interrupted, reading from her phone. "All 3 were converted to upscale franchises within 8 months. The veteran owners were pushed out, their employees laid off, and their communities lost gathering places that had existed for decades." Elena looked at Vincent, searching, his face for signs of the man who'd broken down at the town meeting, who'd committed to making amends through actions rather than words. Instead, she saw the calculating businessman who'd humiliated her 6 weeks ago. "It's a lot of money, Elena," Vincent said again, but his voice carried less conviction. "It's blood money," Tommy said bluntly. "Money made by destroying everything we've built here." Washington appeared from the kitchen, having overheard the conversation. His presence filled the space with the quiet authority of command. "Mr. Sterling, I think you should leave." Sterling's polished demeanor cracked slightly. "This is a business discussion between property owners. This is a veteran-owned establishment," Washington replied evenly, "and you're not welcome here." Elena felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. $2.5 million represented security, escape from the constant stress of keeping a struggling business alive. But it also represented abandoning everything her father had built, betraying the Marines who'd stood by her, walking away from the community that had rallied to support her fight. "Mr. Sterling," Elena said finally, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in Afghanistan, "get out of my diner." Sterling's face hardened. "Ms. Vasquez, you're making a mistake. This offer won't be available indefinitely. Neither will my patience." After Sterling left, Elena turned to Vincent. The partnership that had emerged from conflict now faced its first real test, and Elena wasn't sure which way Vincent would choose. "Vincent, I need to know where you stand. Are we building something together, or are you looking for the first chance to cash out?" Vincent stared at the closed door where Sterling had exited, his internal struggle visible on his face. The answer would determine not just their business relationship, but whether the redemption he'd claimed at the town meeting was genuine or just another performance. "I need time to think," Vincent said finally. Elena nodded, recognizing the honesty even if she didn't like the uncertainty. Take all the time you need, but when you decide, make sure it's a choice you can live with. The test of their fragile alliance had begun. Vincent Romano stood alone in his restaurant at 3 a.m., staring at the corporate contract spread across his mahogany bar. $3 million. The number glowed on the pages like a promise of escape from the complicated mess his life had become since that day he'd humiliated Elena Vasquez. The restaurant felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Smaller somehow, less impressive than the monument to success he'd once believed it to be. Through the window, he could see Elena's diner across the street, dark except for the security light that cast long shadows across the new paint and renovated facade. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, whatever you're thinking about, at this hour, remember that some things matter more than money." Mum would have understood that. Vincent's throat tightened at the mention of his wife. Caroline had died 5 years ago, before he'd become the bitter man who found satisfaction in belittling others. She'd been the one who insisted they attend. Veteran fundraisers who made sure Romano's catered community events at cost, who reminded him that success meant nothing without service to something larger than yourself. The front door chimed, and Elena walked in wearing her father's old marine jacket over jeans and work boots. She moved with the careful precision of someone expecting trouble, but ready to face it anyway. "Figured I'd find you here," Elena said, settling onto a bar stool across from the contract. "Insomnia's a bitch." Vincent nodded, not trusting his voice. They sat in silence for several minutes, two people who'd found themselves unlikely allies after being enemies, now facing a choice that could destroy everything they'd built together. "You know what the money represents to me," Elena said finally. "Safety, security, the ability to walk away from all of this and never have to worry about failing again." "Then why aren't you taking it?" Elena touched the ribbons on her father's jacket, her fingers tracing the decorations that represented service and sacrifice. "Because I learned something in Afghanistan. The Marines who came home weren't always the ones who played it safe. They were the ones who understood that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds suck." Vincent looked at the contract. Again, the numbers swimming slightly in his tired vision. "Elena, I've spent my whole life inheriting other people's success. The restaurant, the reputation, even the money. None of it was really mine. This buyout feels like more of the same." "So what's different now? Working with you, seeing what Sarah's become, watching those Marines show up for someone they'd never met. It's the first time I've been part of something that actually mattered." Vincent's voice cracked slightly. "The first time since Caroline died that I've felt like I was building something instead of just maintaining it." Elena studied his face in the dim light. "Vincent, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we turn down the money and keep building, there's no guarantee it'll work. This could all fall apart in 6 months. We could lose everything." "We could," Vincent agreed, "but at least we'd lose it trying to build something real, instead of selling out to people who see our community as just another acquisition." Elena stood and extended her hand across the bar. "Partners." Vincent looked at her hand, then at the contract, then back at Elena's face. The choice crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. He picked up the corporate contract and, without hesitation, fed it into the paper shredder behind the bar. "Partners," he said, shaking her hand with a firm grip. The next morning brought a different kind of energy to Harbour Street. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community that both restaurant owners had rejected the corporate buyout. Elena's diner filled with locals who wanted to show their support, while Romano's saw its busiest breakfast rush in months. Danny Chen arrived early, his laptop in tow, ready to coordinate the social media response to Pacific Coast's next move. Washington appeared with a clipboard full of plans for expanding the veterans' support services. Sarah Romano brought coffee and the determined energy of someone who'd watched her father choose integrity over easy money. Elena found herself behind the counter of her renovated diner, watching the controlled chaos of a community that had rallied around shared values. The weight of financial uncertainty still pressed on her shoulders, but it felt different now, manageable, shared among people who understood that some fights were worth having. Tommy Morrison wheeled up to the counter, his veteran's cap at its usual angle. "Sergeant, you realize what you've done, don't you? Made a probably stupid decision to turn down more money than I'll ever see again?" "Nah," Tommy grinned. "You've shown this town what it means to choose family over profit. Marines understand that. Community understands that. And now Vincent Romano understands it too." Elena looked across the street where Vincent was visible, through Romano's windows, talking animatedly with customers who seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say for the first time in years. "Think it'll stick?" Elena asked. "With him? We'll see. But with you?" Tommy's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen Elena at her lowest and watched her climb back. "You've already proven that Marines don't retreat. Now you're proving they don't surrender either." Elena smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced since before Afghanistan, genuine hope for the future. The choice had been made. Now came the harder part, making it work. 6 months after rejecting the corporate buyout, Elena stood before a packed auditorium at the National Veterans Conference in Seattle, her hands steady on the podium, despite addressing an audience of over 500 people. The shy, isolated woman who'd once hidden behind her father's coffee machine felt like a distant memory. "When 50 Marines showed up at my diner in dress blues," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "they weren't just supporting one struggling veteran. They were making a statement about what we owe each other, about what community really means." The audience, a mix of veterans, family members, and civilian supporters, listened with the focused attention she remembered from military briefings. Elena had given this presentation 12 times across the country, each time refining her message about veteran-civilian integration and the power of authentic community support. "The Elena Vasquez Foundation isn't about charity," she continued. "It's about creating sustainable models where veterans and civilians work together to build something stronger than either could achieve alone." In the front row, Danny Chen recorded the presentation on his laptop, managing the foundation's social media presence with the same precision he'd once brought to battlefield communications. His non-profit work had expanded beyond Elena's story to supporting veteran-owned businesses across the Pacific Northwest. Behind him, Maria Santos took notes for the Foundation's quarterly report, her nursing background proving invaluable in developing the mental health support components of their programs. She'd taken a leave of absence from the hospital to work full-time on what had grown from a local effort into a national model. After the presentation, Elena found herself surrounded by veterans and community leaders from dozens of towns facing similar challenges. A Vietnam veteran from Missouri described his struggle to keep a feed store open. A Marine from Georgia talked about her catering business that was barely surviving despite community support. "The hardest part," explained Janet Rodriguez, a former Army sergeant from Phoenix, "is convincing civilians that we're not broken, that what we need isn't pity but partnership." Elena nodded, remembering her own journey from isolation to leadership. "It starts with one person willing to bridge that gap. For me, it was Master Sergeant Washington. For your community, it might be someone you haven't met yet." Washington himself appeared at her elbow, his presence as steadying as ever. Over the past months, he'd become the Foundation's unofficial chief operating officer, his military planning skills translating perfectly to nonprofit management. "Sergeant, We've got requests from 8 new communities wanting to implement the Millbrook model, Washington reported, including one from a town council in Maine that saw your presentation online. The Millbrook model, a framework for veteran civilian integration built around community gathering spaces and mutual support, had evolved from Elena's diner into a replicable program. Local businesses partnered with veteran organizations to create spaces where former service members could transition to civilian careers while maintaining the brotherhood that sustained them. Vincent Romano joined their small group, carrying a folder thick with partnership agreements. His transformation from antagonist to advocate continued to surprise everyone, including himself. The National Restaurant Association had featured their veteran employment program in their monthly magazine, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities Vincent never could have imagined. The Denver Restaurant Owners Group wants to pilot our training program, Vincent announced. 3 locations focusing on kitchen management positions for transitioning veterans. Elena accepted the folder, still adjusting to the reality that her father's struggling diner had become the centerpiece of a national movement. The original Elena's Diner remained the heart of their operation, but it now anchored a network that included job training programs, mental health support groups, and business development services. Sarah Romano approached with Tommy Morrison. Beside her, both wearing matching foundation t-shirts that read, "Service Continues." Sarah had changed her major to non-profit management, writing her senior thesis on veteran-civilian economic partnerships. Tommy had become their most effective community liaison, his combination of military experience and small-town connections opening doors across rural America. "Elena, we need to talk logistics," Sarah said, consulting her tablet. "The documentary crew arrives next month, and we've got site visits scheduled in 4 states before the end of the year." Elena felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with growth and attention, but it no longer paralyzed her. The difference was the team around her, people who understood both her mission and her limitations, who could carry the load when the spotlight became too bright. "One thing at a time," Elena replied, echoing advice Washington had given her months ago. "We'll handle what comes next when it comes." Later that evening, Elena sat alone in her hotel room, video calling Tommy Morrison back in Millbrook. Through the screen, she could see the diner in the background, busy with the dinner crowd, staffed by 3 veterans whose transitions had been supported by foundation programs. "How's it feel, Sergeant?" Tommy asked. Being famous and all. Elena considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been facing eviction, struggling to keep her father's legacy alive through sheer stubborn will. Now she was addressing national conferences, consulting with federal agencies on veteran employment policy, and running a foundation that had helped hundreds of veterans across the country. Terrifying, Elena admitted, but also right somehow. Like, this is what I was supposed to be doing. All along. Your dad would be proud. Elena looked at her reflection in the hotel window, seeing not the broken veteran who'd hidden behind the coffee machine, but someone who'd learned to transform pain into purpose. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think he would be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities to support, new barriers to overcome. But tonight, Elena Vasquez felt something she'd thought lost forever in Afghanistan, the deep satisfaction of serving something larger than herself. The ripples continued to spread. Hurricane Melissa roared toward the Oregon coast with the fury of nature unleashed, her 90-mph winds and storm surge, threatening to erase everything Elena and her community had built together. The evacuation order had come at dawn, giving Millbrook's residents 12 hours to secure their lives and livelihoods before the storm made landfall. Elena stood in her diner at 10 a.m., surrounded by Marines, veterans, and civilians, working with military precision to transform the reinforced building into an emergency shelter. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same space where she'd once hidden from the world was now becoming a refuge for others facing their own storms. "Sergeant, we've got the medical station set up in the back dining room," reported Maria Santos, her nursing skills seamlessly integrated with disaster response protocols. 3 backup generators, full medical supplies, and communication equipment courtesy of the Coast Guard. Washington coordinated logistics with the calm efficiency that had made him a legendary NCO. Food supplies are secured, water reserves are topped off, and we've got sleeping arrangements for 50 people. The building inspector confirmed the foundation upgrades will hold against storm surge. Elena nodded, watching through the windows as townspeople arrived with elderly relatives, pets, and whatever possessions they could carry. Vincent Romano supervised the transfer of his restaurant's emergency supplies, having insisted that Romano's entire stock of food and water be moved to the diner for community use. "Elena!" Vincent called out, approaching with his arms full of emergency radios. "The mayor's confirmed that we're the primary evacuation center. The high school took damage from the advance winds. Roof compromised." The weight of responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders, but it felt different from the crushing isolation she'd once carried. This was shared weight, distributed among people who trusted each other enough to face crisis together. Danny Chen burst through the front door, his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and his face flushed with urgency. "Elena, I've been monitoring emergency frequencies. There's a family stranded on Harbor Point, elderly couple with medical needs. Coast Guard can't reach them until the worst of the storm passes." Elena felt her chest tighten, memories of Afghanistan missions flooding back. Harbor Point sat exposed to the worst of the storm surge, accessible only by the old fishing road that would be underwater within hours. "How many people?" Elena asked, already knowing she was going to make a decision others would call reckless. "2, Danny replied. "Henry and Rose Chen, no relation, just coincidence. Both in their 70s, he's diabetic, she's on oxygen. Their son's trying to get permission to reach them, but emergency services are stretched too thin." Elena looked around the diner at the faces of people who'd become her chosen family. Marines who understood impossible missions, civilians who'd learned to trust veteran judgment, leaders who'd discovered that real strength came from lifting others up. Washington, how many volunteers would we need for a rescue run? Washington's expression shifted into the focused intensity she remembered from combat operations. 4, maybe 5. 2 drivers, medical support, communications, and someone who knows the terrain. "I know those roads better than anyone," Tommy Morrison said from his wheelchair position near the radio setup. "Been fishing out there for 40 years. I've got medical training and a 4-wheel drive vehicle," Sarah Romano added, her voice carrying the determined calm she'd inherited from her father's recent transformation. Elena felt the familiar pre-mission tension, the hyper-awareness that came with life-or-death decisions. But unlike Afghanistan, where she'd often felt alone, despite being surrounded by Marines, this decision was being made by people who chose to be here, who'd proven their commitment through months of shared purpose. "Vincent, can you handle shelter? Operations while we're gone?" Vincent straightened, his business owner authority translating smoothly to crisis leadership. "Absolutely. Maria and I will coordinate intake and medical needs." Elena moved toward the door, then paused. A year ago, she'd been broken, isolated, convinced that she was damaged goods, unfit for civilian life. Now she was leading a rescue mission backed by people who understood that service doesn't end with discharge, that community means choosing each other, even when it's dangerous. "Everybody understands the risks?" Elena asked, looking each volunteer in the eye, Semper Fi, Danny responded, echoing the sentiment that had brought 50 Marines to her diner a year ago. The rescue convoy pulled away from Elena's diner as the hurricane's outer bands lashed Millbrook with increasing fury. Elena drove the lead vehicle, her hands steady on the wheel despite the deteriorating conditions. Behind her, the shelter filled, with community members who trusted that she'd return safely, just as she'd learned to trust that they'd be there when she came back. The road to Harbour Point disappeared under rising water as they drove, but Eleanor's GPS showed they were still on course. In the passenger seat, Washington checked their communications equipment one final time. "You know this is crazy, right?" Washington said, his voice carrying the dry humor of someone who'd done crazy things before. "Yeah," Elena replied, navigating around a fallen tree, "but it's the right kind of crazy." Through the storm, Eleanor could see Harbour Point in the distance, where two elderly people waited for rescue they probably thought would never come. Behind her, the diner glowed like a beacon through the rain, proof that some things were strong, enough to weather any storm. Elena Vasquez was no longer retreating. She was advancing in a different direction, leading people who'd chosen to follow her towards something worth the risk. The Brotherhood had taught her that some bonds never break. Now she was proving that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds look impossible, especially then. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.